Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I never expected a conversation over the garden fence to change the way I saw marriage, mine or anyone else's. But that's exactly what happened on a cool September afternoon, just as the leaves began turning the color of old gold and burnt copper. I was standing in my backyard, trimming the overgrown lavender that had started to droop from its own weight. My hands smelled of crushed blossoms and earth, and my mind was lost in one of those quiet midlife reveries that sneak up on you when the kids are grown and the house is too quiet. At 58, with a husband I cared for but barely understood anymore, those moments were coming more often. That's when I heard the light knock on the wooden slats of the fence that divided my yard from Karen's. She lived alone in the house next door, a widow for nearly a decade, but lately I'd noticed someone new. An older man with silver hair and a cautious smile, coming and going from her place. Elaine. Her voice floated over the fence. You got a minute? I walked over, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. Of course. Everything okay? She peered through a knot in the wood, then laughed softly. I hate this old fence. We've lived next to each other for 12 years, and we're still talking through holes like spies. I smiled. Well, you're always welcome to come through the gate. There was a pause. Then the gate creaked open, and there she was, Karen, 63 years old and glowing with the kind of peace I hadn't seen on her face in years. She looked different, lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been lifted off her chest. I could use some company, she said gently, and maybe a cup of that mint tea you make so well. We sat on the back patio, the steam from our cups curling in the cool air. The wind carried the scent of apples from somewhere nearby. My husband was inside, probably watching golf. It was just the two of us and the distant rustle of leaves. I've been wanting to tell you something, Karen began, her voice low. But I wasn't sure how. I leaned forward, curiosity sparking in my chest. Go on. She looked into her tea, then back at me. You've seen Harold, the man who's been visiting. I nodded. He's not just visiting, she said. He's my, well, partner, I suppose. Companion, maybe. I don't like the word boyfriend at our age. I chuckled. Understandable. I wasn't looking for anyone, she said quickly. For years, I thought I was done with love. After Mark passed, I told myself that part of life was over. But then Harold moved into the neighborhood last spring, and we started talking. Just little things at first. About gardening, books, grandchildren. We'd meet by accident on walks and wind up talking for an hour. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, and I could feel something warm stirring in my chest. But then her smile faded, and she looked down again. But that's not the part I needed to tell you, she said softly. It's about my marriage to Mark. There were things, deep things, that I never spoke of. And now that I've found someone who sees me, really sees me, I realize how much I gave up, how much of myself I silenced. I set my cup down carefully. Karen, what do you mean? She took a long breath and met my gaze. Mark was a good man, she said. But he believed in roles. Husband provides, wife supports. Everything was routine, predictable. Even affection felt like a scheduled tour. I played the part because I thought that's what marriage meant. Stability, duty, sacrifice. I never questioned it, until he was gone. She paused, the silence stretching between us, not heavy, but reverent. Harold is different, she said finally. We talk about everything. There's this emotional honesty I never knew I needed. He asks me questions that Mark never did. About my dreams, my fears, even about things that are hard to admit. We've had some of the most intimate conversations of my life without even touching. It's awakened something in me. A part of myself I had buried so long ago, I almost forgot it existed. I felt my breath catch. I'd known Karen for years, but I'd never heard her speak like this, openly, vulnerably, like she was peeling back a layer of herself she usually kept tucked away. I thought intimacy was only physical, she went on. But with Harold, it's emotional. Spiritual, almost. We hold hands sometimes and just sit in silence, and it's the most connected I've ever felt to another human being. I didn't know what to say. My own marriage, while not unhappy, was certainly not filled with moments like that. We were companions, yes, but were we connected? Karen reached across the table and took my hand gently. I'm not telling you this to brag, she said. I'm telling you because I see it in your eyes. You've been wondering if there's more, and I need you to know. It's never too late to rediscover yourself, or to be truly seen. Her words hit me like a soft, warm wind, gentle but undeniable. She wasn't just talking about her relationship. She was holding up a mirror to mine, and I wasn't sure I was ready to look. But something had stirred inside me, and I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. That night, after Karen left, I sat in the living room, lights dimmed, the low murmur of the television drifting from the den where my husband, Richard, was finishing his usual evening routine. Golf highlights, then the weather, then bed. We'd done this dance for nearly 35 years. It was familiar, comforting in a way, but that evening, for the first time, it felt like watching someone else's life through a window. Karen's words kept echoing in my mind, to be truly seen. When I married Richard, I was 23, fresh out of college with stars in my eyes and a heart that believed in the forever kind of love. And in many ways, he gave me that. He worked hard, came home every night, provided for us, and never strayed. But somewhere between raising 2 children, surviving recessions, and taking care of aging parents, we stopped looking at each other, really looking. We became excellent co-pilots, but I realized we hadn't flown toward each other in years. The next day, I walked into the kitchen just as Richard was pouring his coffee. He glanced up and smiled, automatic and soft. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, then hesitated. "Do you think we talk enough?" That caught him off guard. He turned, mug in hand. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do we really talk? About us? About how we feel?" He chuckled, not unkindly. "We've been together so long, I feel like we already know what the other one's thinking." I managed to smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. Maybe that's the problem. He frowned slightly, and for a moment, I saw confusion in his face. Maybe even fear. Then he reached for the toast and changed the subject. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the backyard again, as if drawn there by something unspoken. I wasn't surprised when the gate creaked and Karen's soft steps approached behind me. "I didn't mean to shake you up," she said, folding her arms gently. "No," I said, turning to her. "I'm glad you did. You made me realize how long it's been since I asked myself what I really feel." We sat again on the patio, our knees blanketed by the late afternoon sun. This time, I did most of the talking. "I used to write," I told her. "Before the kids, before everything got busy. I kept journals, short stories, silly things mostly. But they made me feel alive. I haven't picked up a pen in over 2 decades. Why'd you stop? She asked. I shrugged. Life. Richard thought it was a phase, and I didn't have the energy to argue. After a while, I stopped needing to express myself out loud. I just faded into the rhythm of what I was supposed to be. Karen leaned in. But you're still here, Elaine. That voice, your voice, it's still inside you. We fell into a silence that was oddly comforting. 2 women, both on the far side of 50, rediscovering what it meant to feel something deeper than duty. Karen reached into her coat pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. This is something I wrote after Mark died. I don't show it to many people. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the neat handwriting. Grief is a house with too many rooms, all filled with echoes and unopened letters. But somewhere in the attic of memory, love breathes again in forgotten corners. I read it twice. The second time, I felt the tears sting the corners of my eyes. You should share this, I whispered. It's beautiful. She smiled. I already did. With Harold. He's the one who encouraged me to write again. That evening, I went into the attic to find my old journals. They were dusty and smelled of forgotten dreams, but as I flipped through the pages, a small spark lit in my chest. A part of me had been waiting quietly all these years, waiting to be remembered. And as I sat there, scribbling thoughts on a yellowed notebook, I felt the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. A week passed before I saw Karen again, but in that time, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote. Not just a sentence or 2, not a grocery list, not a card for someone else. I wrote from me. It wasn't perfect. The words stumbled, my thoughts scattered, but the act itself, the sound of the pen scraping across the page, the way memories flowed freely when I let them, reminded me of the woman I used to be, the woman I still was, beneath the layers. It was a quiet morning when she came by again. The sky had that pale, gentle glow that only autumn mornings seemed to carry, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and damp leaves. Karen knocked on the back door this time, smiling with that warm energy that always seemed to precede something meaningful. I want you to come with me, she said, without even saying hello. I blinked. Where? There's a small reading circle. At the community center. Thursday evenings. It's not a big deal, just a handful of us sharing pieces we've written. Nothing formal, no judgment. I hesitated. Don't know if I'm ready for that. Karen leaned in, voice soft but firm. You are. And you don't have to read anything if you don't want to. Just come, sit, listen. That Thursday, I stood outside the community center for almost 10 minutes before going in. My palms were damp, and I kept checking my watch like I had somewhere better to be. But finally, I pushed open the door. The room smelled of old books and fresh coffee. About a dozen people sat in a circle, some with notepads, others with worn-out folders. Karen waved me over with a proud, almost maternal smile. They read poems and letters, short stories, and journal entries. Most weren't polished, but that didn't matter. The honesty in their voices, the rawness of what they shared, it settled deep in me. These were people with history etched into their words. People like me. When Karen read, I saw her in a new light. Her voice trembled slightly, but carried strength. She wrote about rediscovery, about fear and freedom, about late-in-life beginnings. When she finished, the room was silent for a long, respectful beat before the clapping began. Afterward, she turned to me. You wrote something, didn't you? I nodded. Will you read it next week? I looked at her. something stirred again, that soft ache of being seen, being encouraged, not for what I do for others, but for who I am. "Yes," I said. "Next week." That night, I lay in bed beside Richard, staring at the ceiling. I hadn't told him where I'd gone. He hadn't asked. He'd fallen asleep halfway through a documentary, the television still casting flickers of blue across the room. For a moment, I just watched him sleep. He wasn't a bad man. He'd been loyal, faithful, present. But I realized something quietly heartbreaking. We hadn't asked each other a meaningful question in years. In the dim light, I whispered, "Do you still see me?" He didn't stir. I turned away, and the tears came quietly. The following week, I read my piece of the group. My hands trembled, my voice cracked, but I did it. When I looked up, Karen was smiling, tears in her eyes. So were a few others. Not because what I wrote was extraordinary, but because it was real. Afterward, a man named Carl, a retired English teacher with a soft southern drawl, approached me. "Your words," he said gently, "they hit somewhere deep. Don't stop writing." And that night, I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled out another blank page and began again. The days turned cooler. Leaves gave up their grip on the trees and spun slowly to the ground, carpeting everything in gold and rust. One Saturday afternoon, I invited Karen and Harold over for coffee. Richard, slightly caught off guard, agreed politely. I watched as he sat beside Harold, a man who seemed to radiate calm confidence. They spoke about books, surprisingly, and about the neighborhoods they grew up in. I saw something in Richard's eyes I hadn't seen in a while: engagement. After they left, he turned to me. "He's not what I expected." "How so?" "I thought he'd be one of those smooth-talking types, you know. But he's grounded." I nodded. "He's helped Karen find herself again." He looked at me. "Have you been looking for something, too?" There it was. A question. A real one. I met his eyes. "Yes, and I think I'm starting to find it." He didn't ask more. He just nodded. Then, gently, he reached across the table and took my hand, just for a moment. His skin was warm, familiar. And for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like we were going through motions. It felt like the beginning of a conversation we'd forgotten how to have. Thanksgiving arrived with its usual bustle of casseroles, cranberry sauce, and folding chairs squeezed around our too small dining room table. Both kids came home, our son with his quiet, bookish wife, and our daughter with her second boyfriend this year, who, to his credit, offered to do the dishes without being asked. As we passed plates and refilled glasses, I noticed something different in the way Richard moved around the kitchen. He was more attentive, not just to the turkey, but to me. When our daughter complimented the apple pie, he said, "Elaine made it the way her grandmother used to. She's been writing again, too. You should read what she's working on." I blinked at him, surprised, not because of the praise, but because he knew. Later, after the kids had gone upstairs and the kitchen was clean, I found him sitting at the table with a glass of bourbon, staring out at the backyard where the lavender now slept under frost. "Karen and Harold," he said without turning. "They seem good together." I joined him. "They are?" He swirled the glass slowly. "Do you ever think we missed out on something?" I hesitated. Sometimes. But I also think we gave up parts of ourselves to raise a family, keep a house, live a life. That wasn't wrong. But maybe we forgot to come back to each other when the dust settled. He looked at me then, not with regret, but with something gentler, a kind of quiet resolve. "I'd like to try," he said. to find whatever it is we misplaced. A lump formed in my throat. So would I. In the weeks that followed, we started taking evening walks. Nothing fancy, just around the block, a few laps, hand in hand when the cold wasn't too sharp. We talked, not just about bills or groceries, but about things we hadn't spoken of in years. He asked me about my writing. I asked him about the books he used to love before work had buried that part of him. We were learning to see each other again. One evening, Karen invited me over alone. She poured us a glass of wine, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that didn't need permission anymore. "I've decided to move in with Harold," she said. "Not right away, but soon. Life's too short to live it in separate houses when your hearts already live in the same one." I smiled. "I'm happy for you. Truly." She leaned forward. "And you? How are things with Richard?" I took a breath. Different. Better. In ways. But not easy. We're unlearning old habits. Peeling back the layers. "That's the beauty of later chapters," she said softly. "They don't have to follow the same script." Before I left, she handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a leather journal embossed with my initials. "New stories belong in new pages," she said. I hugged her tight. "You changed my life, you know." She pulled back, her eyes moist. "No, you changed yours. I just helped you turn the doorknob." One chilly morning, I sat with Richard on the back patio. A fresh dusting of snow clung to the fence, and steam curled from our mugs. "I read your latest piece," he said suddenly. I turned to him, surprised. "You did?" He nodded. "The part about feeling invisible, that hit me." I swallowed. "I was scared to let you read that." "I'm glad you did." He paused. "Because I've felt that way too. I just never had the words." We sat in silence, the kind that felt like healing. Not all wounds need loud apologies. Sometimes acknowledgement is enough to begin again. A month later, I read at the community center again. This time, Richard came with me. He sat in the back, hands clasped, his eyes never leaving mine as I read a story about love rediscovered in unexpected places. When I finished, the room clapped. But Richard, he stood, and that meant more to me than any applause. It's funny how life opens up when you stop pretending the doors are locked. Sometimes the keys are right there, hidden beneath dusty journals, buried dreams, or a neighbor's soft voice telling you the truth you've been afraid to say out loud. And sometimes the person you needed to meet was living next door all along, not to change your life, but to remind you it's still yours to shape. So if you're listening to this, wherever you are, ask yourself the question I was too scared to ask for too long. Are you being seen? Because once you are, there's no going back. And that, my friend, is where everything truly begins.